The title of the panel is What to Expect from U.S. Trade Post-Election, the Bipartisan Factors That Will Impact Our Trading Partners. And our featured speaker is Fred Hochberg. I'll speak a little bit more about Fred later, but today's event is part of a series of TAİK Transatlantic Talks. For the inaugural event, TAİK and my colleague, Senator Vitter, hosted Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina for a discussion on the Turkish-American supply chain. And I thought that was a wonderful talk. Let me give a little background on TAİK, which I'm sure you all know, is one of the biggest and most influential business organizations in Turkey. It focuses on providing economic relations between Turkey, economic and trade relations between Turkey and the U.S., and has an annual target goal of 100 billion in trade. TAİK has been hosting webinar sessions for members to listen to prominent leaders, writers, academic and businessmen, entrepreneurs, and innovators, particularly on the impact of the COVID pandemic and different aspects of life, business life, economics, and other things having to do with, with what's going on in the United States. Just a quick background. TAİK has organized throughout its history high-level meetings with government official, business people, NGOs, American diplomats. TAİK has hosted meetings with former U.S. President Bill Clinton, Vice President Joe Biden, former U.S. Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Robert Mosbacher, as well as William Daley and Penny Pritzker, and former Secretaries of Energy such as Spencer Abraham and Samuel Bowden, as well as U.S. Secretaries of Defense Robert Gates, Leon. Some of the members of TAİK include companies like Citibank, Frito-Lay, The Gap, Ford, Honeywell, Microsoft, Turkcell, Turk Telecom, and Turkish Airlines. So, as you all know, this is a key partner in the world, and one that our firm, through Morris Reed and the different partners, spend a great deal of focusing on these important issues, and in particular, developing their relationships in the U.S. I want to take a moment and introduce several folks that are going to be participating with us. But first off, I want to introduce TAİK Deputy Chairman Seymour Tari. He is going to speak to us for a few moments, but talk about what exactly is going on, and he has some interesting discussion. But Seymour was formerly with McKinsey & Company in Istanbul, focusing on the corporate portfolio strategy, and at Caterpillar Inc. in Geneva as a product manager with responsibility for the EMEA and CIS regions. Seymour has an MBA from InState and a BS and MS in mechanical engineering and robotics from ETH Zurich. Seymour, if you could say a few words and then introduce the DEİK President, Nail Olpak.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our important discussion on the post-election future of the United States' bilateral trade partnerships, in particular, the Turkey-US partnership. This is the latest transatlantic talks in the Turkey-US Business Council series of vital conversations regarding Turkish-American relations. We are delighted to be joined this afternoon by esteemed experts who will discuss and take questions regarding how Turkey and the United States can aspire to reach the combined trade goal that has been set for our nations. I'll begin by thanking Mr. Nail Olpak, the President of DEİK, the Foreign Economic Relations Board of Turkey, for participating in today's webinar. Over the past 35 years, DEİK has deftly managed economic relations between Turkey and all our international allies, boosting investment and trade opportunities for Turkish organizations around the world. Thank you, Nail Bey, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your expert remarks today. I would also like to thank the Honorable Joe Garcia, who represented the great state of Florida in Congress, for serving as our moderator today. There are many Turkish businesses who have established ties and facilities in Florida, and one of TAİK's 7 state committees focuses on Florida. The trade relationship between Florida and Turkey currently represents tens of millions of dollars in imports and exports. Thank you, Joe. Which leads me to also thank our most esteemed guest today, Mr. Fred Hochberg, the former chair and president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States and author of the best-selling new book, Trade is Not a 4-Letter Word. We look forward to learning of your ideas and analysis of the future of U.S.-Turkish trade opportunities. And we are also most interested in your perspective on the potential of different types of financing options that we can utilize to help reach our trade goal, a subject on which there may be no greater authority than yourselves. Before I turn it over to Mr. Olpak, I would like to say that I was so pleased to see that earlier this week, Presidents Erdogan and Trump spoke directly and continued their ongoing conversation about how our two nations can work together to reach the ambitious goal of increasing bilateral trade between us to $100 billion. Both TAİK and DEİK know that stronger integration of the Turkish and US economies will strengthen our long-standing alliance, one that is critical not only for economic prosperity, but also for regional and worldwide stability in general. We look forward to creating more opportunities for Turkish and American organizations to do business together. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Nail Olpak, DEİK President.
Thank you, Seymour. And also I would like to thank to TAİK, which has already done so much to increase bilateral trade and investment opportunities for Turkey and US, particularly in sectors of energy, liquefied natural gas, agricultural products, textiles, automotive parts, furniture, and white goods. And just to say a few words about DEİK, DEİK is committed to increase economic opportunities for Turkish business community and counterparts around the world. And for that purpose, we have 146 country-to-country business council, where TAİK is the first and the biggest one. Yes, today we are going to focus on the subjects we have already mentioned. If you allow me, apart from those things, I want to ask few more things, including the new normal with and after COVID-19 to Mr. Hochberg. Since apart from my duty in DEİK, I am also a board member of Turkish Exim Bank and Turkcell. Now, we were all speaking about globalization for years, and we started to speak about glocalization lately, and it seems we'll concentrate more on that after this pandemic. This is the first point. Second, it seems not only our daily habits or style of doing business is moving to some new normal, but also different sectors, including the finance sector, including federal banks' roles are being affected since federal banks started direct investment support programs, which was not so usual so far. This is the second point. As third, we have been speaking about economics of scale when we were speaking about competition and so on so far. But now we really realized that the problems of bounding to one big supplier is staying over here. And finally, we have been speaking about being near or far, being cheaper or expensive, but now we all realize the importance of availability, which was really important. And as my comment, we don't exactly know which sectors will be the rising ones, although of course we have some important idea, but the one who secured the supply chain and built up the real trust to the counterparts will be the winners, and the key word will be trust. This is my comment. Now, what would you want to say about those points? I really want to hear your comments. And of course, I believe discussions like the one we are having today will offer us new actionable ideas to reach our goal. Thank you to Honorable Joe Garcia for serving as our moderator. And of course, thanks to our special guest, Mr. Fred Hochberg, for sharing his expertise. He is going to share, of course, and views with us today. The discussions of today, including the future of international supply chains and how Turkey's role, if we have time, will play an integral role in establishing newer and stronger supply avenues next year, this year, and beyond, I think will be the important points. With that, I will turn it over to Joe Garcia to kick off today's conversation. And thank you all for spending time with us.
Thank you, Mr. Terry. I really appreciate it. I think you'd make a much better moderator. You're focused on this, but we're all looking forward to this. Look, introducing Fred is also introducing a Fred. Fred has lived much of his life in South Florida in the last few years. And I, as well as Fred, were parts. Early on, I was in the Obama administration, then I went over to Congress. But Fred was on the plane back and forth with me to South Florida many a time, obviously keeping his relationship with his community, but at the same time, carrying on a very important word. I'm midway through the book, Fred's book, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I suggest when you finish this to purchase Fred's book because it's very good. Really quickly, I know Fred doesn't need that long of an introduction, but let me do it real quick. Fred is a seasoned business executive who recently finished 8 years as Export-Import Bank chairman, and he served for 8 years, was the longest serving member of the bank. From 2004 to 2008, Mr. Hochberg was also Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs and Management and Urban Policy at the New School in New York City. And from 1998 to 2001, he served as deputy and then acting administrator of the SBA in the Clinton administration. Prior to his service at SBA, Mr. Hochberg was the longtime president and chief operating officer of Lillian Vernon. So it is with great pleasure that I will invite Fred to say a few quick comments, and then I'll start peppering him with questions. Fred?
Well, thank you. Thank you for TAİK. Thank you for Joe and also Morris Reed of Mercury for bringing me in, and Suella for organizing and taking care of all of this. I made a number of trips to Turkey as chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank. We did work with, particularly with Turkish Airlines. I remember a visit to Ankara and to the Ataturk Memorial, where there's a rather well-renowned flagpole that was put up by a Turkish-American businessman at this very important national shrine. And I always thought when I visited that upon one of my trips to Turkey, how that was a good embodiment of the strong relationship and the desire for even a stronger relationship with Turkey. So those are my recollections as chairman of Export-Import Bank. One of the challenges I will tell you that, and I like the goal of $100 billion of trade between the US and Turkey, which would be about a 5-fold increase from where we are today. And I remember vividly when I was in Turkey, one of the issues that continually came up was the trade balance and the concern that there might be a deficit, a trade deficit in one direction or another. I'm hoping, it's one of the things I try and talk about in my book, and I'm hoping as both countries move towards $100 billion in trade, that we don't let the trade deficit get in the way. At the end of the day, the benefits of the United States and Turkey having a strong economic tie that would be built by trade is more important than if the deficit on the U.S. side or the Turkish side is plus or minus $5 billion. That is quote unquote, as we say in the United States, small potatoes. What's important is that this become a more robust economic partnership. And I would say we have a work cut out for us, to be honest. And that's why I'm happy that TAİK is doing this work, because I think the trade and the connections between the U.S. and Turkey should be much stronger than they are. And I think that trade would be a real strong vehicle to make that happen. And it was also would include more work in terms of beyond the purview just of TAİK, things like the Fulbright program, education exchanges, cultural exchanges. These are things that I think would go a long way towards tightening the bonds between the United States and Turkey. That have often been at the very highest level of government, but I think could be far deeper in the economic and business sector than it is today. So that was one of the reasons I was excited to accept this invitation today. Plus, it's hard to say no to Joe Garcia and Morris Reed. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Joe. We can, because you gave me enough questions. We could be here for a few hours.
Well, listen, again, thank you, Fred. And let's start with what kind of permanent changes to the global supply chain do you envisage from the result of this pandemic?
Well, I think, the world has prospered enormously from globalism and global supply chains. They have increased innovation. They have reduced cost. I give you one factor in the United States I outline in my book. Americans today spend less than 20% of their disposable income on food and clothing. Around World War II was 50%. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was close to 60%. So a lot of that has to do with innovation, automation, and trade. But I think what we've learned in the COVID crisis is that I come away with two things. One, supply chains, in addition to being innovative and helping us find new products and reducing costs, also need to be more resilient and more robust. And by that, I mean, if all the supplies, and even taking out of the healthcare field, if all the supplies in automotive, in different sectors of our economy come only from perhaps one manufacturer or one factory in one country, that creates some vulnerability. Creates vulnerabilities. Obviously, we've seen that clearly in this pandemic, but it creates a vulnerability if we have a natural disaster or political turmoil or a number of other things that could disrupt a supply chain. So we have seen that. And I think one inclination is to bring things home, to bring manufacturing home. I think that'd be a mistake. I think what we need to do is make our supply chains more robust, more diversified, making sure that if you're in the medical field, that we have strong alliances and are purchasing from around the world as part of the supply chain versus trying to bring it all home. Because bring it all home, whether it's the United States or Turkey, we will never perfectly anticipate all the needs we have. So far better to develop much more robust supply chains. And I would also say, in that regard, hopefully the takeaway, what we learned from this crisis is we need to strengthen those alliances, not try and isolate ourselves, isolate the United States or the EU or Turkey or the Middle East, but actually realize our strength is going to be working together and not trying to do everything ourselves.
Great. Fred, which nations do you see as the most important rising powers in manufacturing?
Well, listen, it is still clearly China is a very formidable manufacturing hub. There's no question about it. But, let's also remember the United States, until the beginning of the 21st century, was the largest exporter of goods in the world. we were in 2002, the U.S. was overtaken by Germany. And then in 2010, China overtook Germany. We then moved back into second place. So clearly places like the United States, China, Germany, Turkey, I recall, has a very strong manufacturing sector. So that would also be another place. Still, Southeast Asia is an important place for manufacturing. I have concerns about Sub-Saharan Africa, to be honest with you, because more and more manufacturing is going to be requiring even regional and local supply chains and more automation. And so the advantages countries like Bangladesh and Southeast Asia had in terms of jumpstarting their economy with producing low-skilled goods, I'm not sure that opportunity is going to be available to a place like Sub-Saharan Africa, which was available in Southeast Asia. Another area that I know you've asked me where the most, I'm not as optimistic, frankly, about Latin America. Latin America has been more of a source of commodities. Its education system has not been as strong and robust. So I think that to recap, the United States, China, Germany, Turkey, Southeast Asia, those are the places we're going to see.
Okay. We recently saw that Biden's campaign released a detailed supply chain plan. And Vice President Biden advocates for a stronger domestic supply chain in several areas and says the U.S. is dangerously dependent on foreign suppliers. If there's a Biden presidency, how do you expect it will differentiate on trade from Trump?
Well, I think the major changes is I don't think this is going to be an administration that is going to resort to tariffs and a trade war. And those have been hallmarks of the Trump administration. And I would venture to say not successful initiatives on the part of the Trump administration. Tariffs were somewhat of a tool of the 20th century that was largely discarded. We entered a period of basically low tariff trade until President Trump came into the White House and revived that tool. So I think we're not going to see trade wars. We're not going to see tariffs. We're not going to see these kind of quotas. But we're going to, I see a Biden administration, and I've known the vice president for, goodness, over 30 years. And recall he chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. I think we're going to see a presidency that values alliances. One of the strongest attributes of the United States has been our alliances. There was a meeting that was reported to me with Hank Paulson under President George W. Bush and his counterpart in China in the 2006-2007 period, where essentially the Chinese said, you, the United States, you have all the good allies in the world. Unstated was, who do we have? We have North Korea and Cambodia. So one of our best resources is our alliances and building alliances, both not just for national security, for trade, for a better life for our citizens, is something that the United States has had and has cultivated over a long time. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that Vice President Biden, I think he will win in November, and I think he will go to work quickly on trying to restore those alliances and the benefits that the United States gains and the rest of the world gains from both that leadership and those alliances.
The next question, Fred, is one that Morris Reed stresses a lot, and it has to do with long-term positioning, right? So post-2020, whichever way the election goes, what industries do you think are most ripe for U.S. allies like Turkey, who want to participate in areas in the U.S. Where the U.S. would be keen to create a new partner in the international supply chain?
Well, one of the things I recall from my visits to Turkey was meeting with a number of the contractors who build infrastructure. And Turkey has a well-deserved and legendary experience in this area, both not as much in the U.S., but certainly in the CIS and the Mideast. We have a huge infrastructure deficit in this country. We have been giving it lip service and not really spending the kind of resources we need to do so. Joe and I live in Florida, and thankfully Miami at last is going to be rebuilding some of the highways that access to the port and so forth. Those are a long time coming. So I think one of the opportunities for Turkish companies would be to participate in that. I mean, just to give you an example, the company that actually built the tunnel to the port of Miami is a French company. And they have a strong presence in the United States and do exporting from the United States, even to places like Sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the, as I said, great advantages I think Turkey has is its ability to build large-scale projects. And I think that finding the relationships, working with people like Mercury and others to tap into those would be a real opportunity for Turkish companies.
In the book, you talk about the issue of trade wars, and you say they typically don't have winners. What do you see as the primary downside for the U.S. entering into trade wars with allies, like, say, the steel tariff incident with Turkey?
I don't know. When you're a little kid and your brother or older brother, younger brother pushes you and you push back and you go, he pushed me first. No, you pushed me first. No, you pushed me first. That's the problem with the trade war. We start one, they get escalated. People's pride gets in the way. I'm not going to be pushed around by this country. I'm going to retaliate. And the retaliation gets easily out of hand. So I would say that's one of the problems with the trade wars. They particularly among friends. So they are very difficult to de-escalate. And it's similar with tariffs. Once you put tariffs in, frequently governments get used to the revenue. I outline in my book, we have a tariff on children's shoes in this country. As one example, it generates $12 billion in revenue for the US government. And it is one reason why it has not been removed. We don't make children's shoes. It's not to actually protect a US industry, but the government says, well, if you're going to get rid of that tariff on shoes, you have to find the revenue someplace else. Joe knows this from being in Congress. Coming up with finding $12 billion someplace else is really not something most members of Congress, most legislators want to do. So what happens? It stays in place. And by staying in place, what we actually do is hurt working families, hurt actually low-income families more. But these things are so hard to undo. So that's one reason trade wars and tariff wars are bad to start, because they're really hard to de-escalate.
Well, you talk about, you've had many conversations with ardent protectionists, and do you ever convince them that trade is good for America? And what are those conversations like? As someone in Congress who was someone who believed in free trade, and so we turned it into a fair trade as an easier way to talk about it. But it's a difficult thing. How do you envision that conversation? Because if there's one thing that politicians are not, is having a long vision, right? There's this sort of the benefits of trade usually do not visit upon those who pass those things into law. Well,
bluntly, I actually hope my book helps that, because I try and make the case where trade has helped. And a couple of thoughts on that, Joe. One is, contrary to what many believe, the North America Free Trade Agreement, now USMCA, which stitched together the US, Canada, and Mexico, for example, in automobile manufacturing assembly, I believe in many ways saved the auto industry. The fact is that we are now much more globally competitive because of working together with Canada, US, and Mexico. And we have the US Mexico Canadian agreement. And by the way, the name change is important because it's not simply a rebranding. It is less about North America, regrettably, and more about the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And we'll have to see how well this comes through. Again, Joe knows this from his time in Congress. I think there were, excuse me, a unique set of circumstances how that got through Congress. You know, President Trump is very much seen as a protectionist, and as a result, some of the Democrats who might normally be opposed to a trade deal felt that they had a real protectionist in President Trump that they haven't frankly seen in a President Clinton or President Obama or President Bush. So I think that there were some unique circumstances that made USMCA come to pass. I think it's hard to make the case on trade to a number of people in labor. I think, though, the USMCA does put some markers down in terms of what kind of labor standards are going to be in agreements, what kind of environmental standards will be in agreements. The fact that the dispute settlement is not much as tilted in favor of companies as it was in previous agreements. So that will give us some hints to that. But I'm not that terribly optimistic we're going to see a lot of new trade deals in the years to come.
Fred, just as an aside, do you think that the redone trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, do you think it's a better document than where we started? Because I think some people miss that Democrats had a lot more in the details. Pelosi and the Democrats had much more to say than in the past, where the executive sort of ran the ball. In this case, I think some of the values that were in TTIP and other trade deals that were in the works sort of visited this new document.
Thank you, Joe. I think that Ambassador Lighthizer, who is the United States Trade Representative, deserves enormous credit. In speaking to so many Democratic friends on the Hill, the level of consultation between the Trump administration and members of Congress and making substantial changes in the agreement to secure their support and vote went a long way. And I would say that they felt far more listened to, far more input, and far more hand in crafting the final agreement than they have in previous years. And so in that way, that is a template. That is a template in terms of what it will take to move agreements forward. And, you know, we can also do business without a free trade agreement. I mean, we trade with many countries. Vietnam is a good example without a free trade agreement. So that is not a requirement. It enhances the integration, but it doesn't mean it's not an on-off switch. It's like a dimmer switch in your home. It's either more intense or less intense. But I would say you're absolutely right. Robert Lighthizer deserves a lot of credit for really working with members of Congress to really secure their support for the bill.
We've seen in particular this administration in the U.S., but we see it around the world. What's the antidote to the politicization of trade, world trade? How do we make it easier to talk about and less political?
Well, I think part of the problem is frequently we talk about trade deals and world trade in terms of local jobs, and I cited in the book about the Trans-Pacific Partnership for TPP is the acronym, was often sold on jobs, and I somewhat humorously to point out the word jobs appears 8 times in 5,000 pages. And 2 of them is because it's the Labor Department in both Japan and Australia. So partly, I think we need to talk about the benefits of trade and not try and not try and tell people, well, this will create a bunch more new jobs. Exports create jobs. Trade is not as clear. And the part of the issue is, as we know with Turkey, we cannot find ways to export without importing. Partly we get better products, and also countries say, well, wait, we want to participate in that as well. So I think we've got to find ways that we speak more candidly, speak more honestly with people about the benefits of trade. I think we've seen in the United States, I'm not as familiar in Turkey, but our social safety net, what supports people if they're lost their job or out of their job, has been somewhat weak for many, many decades. And I think we've seen that clearly with the COVID crisis. And I think what's needed is to make sure that countries have a stronger support system that will support workers if they lose their jobs due to trade, or frankly, more importantly, these days, automation is much more the issue than trade. And we haven't done that in the past, and we need to fix that. And lastly, I would say, and I would be curious how this applies in Turkey, but we need people, all of us, to become, the term is lifelong ready for new jobs and new opportunities. Just the way if we're going to have a terrible hurricane or a storm, you may have to buy extra food supplies and fuel for the car. We need to always be ready because our jobs are going to be changing. And one of the things of this COVID crisis is I believe the economy is going to change even at a faster rate than it has. Look at this Zoom thing. I mean, what we're doing today was not something we did routinely a year ago. We would have had a meeting in Washington or Ankara. It would have taken a lot of logistics, and you're able to bring in, as we were just talking before we started, several hundred of these programs to members in Turkey. That was not possible before. So that is going to dramatically change. It's going to change business travel, the airline industry, the hotel industry at a very rapid rate. And how we all are able to adjust to that is going to take government and political leadership that we need to encourage people to keep learning and to keep evolving.
So the next question I've got for you, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but do you see the U.S. once again working to sign regional trade pacts like TPP or NAFTA, or is that part of a bygone era?
Well, almost, Joe, you might have a better answer for that as a member of Congress. I think the reason that regional ones, or the idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership linking 12 countries, in part is it is so difficult in our country to get passage of a trade agreement that to do it with one country, the effort is enormous. I mean, the agreement with South Korea, Colombia, and Panama took close to 6 or 7 years from the time George Bush started it, and it got passed under President Obama. So I think the thinking is something regional, at least the benefits would be large enough that it would be worth that effort. But again, I think trade deals are in for a tough time, and particularly in light of the COVID crisis. I think what would be better, we may just need to strengthen our global ties, but it may not be through trade deals. It should be through things like the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, and other things maybe have to come first.
One of the things that Morris always points out to TAİK members as well as to our Turkish friends is advice for manufacturing. Right, Turkey is a big manufacturer, and if you were giving some strategic advice to manufacturers right now about what's next and what's beyond, particularly as Turkish manufacturers look at the U.S. as a market, what opportunities do you see there, and what do you think they should start thinking about?
Well, I think that one of the things that saw in the United States and that I researched in preparing for this book is the number of, and the auto industry is a good place to look, is, the fact is BMW is the largest exporter of vehicles from the United States. And if you want to own a BMW sport utility vehicle, an SUV, it's going to be built in the US, not in Germany. So I think that those kinds of foreign investment in the United States, in Turkey, goes a long way towards tapping into the resources around the world, and also builds a lot of allies. Because if you're manufacturing in South Carolina, in the case of BMW, you have relationships with the local population, with the government, with the governor, members of Congress, and that actually helps shape relationships. So that's one of the things to think about in terms of, and I would say this for TAİK members, not just for the US, but frankly, globally. The more that you are engaged globally, you build up relationships, because it's much better to have relationships that are also at the people-to-people level and not simply two heads of government. Two heads of government can easily fall out of love and have differences, but what often will keep them together is the fact that there's strong economic ties. And frankly, if we look at the US and China, I mean, our economies are more intertwined than perhaps the White House would like. And that in some way is keeping it, quote unquote, from going off the rails, because there are so many economic ties that have somewhat kept it in a better place than it might be otherwise.
So what do you, when you look at the market structure, what do you believe will be beneficial post COVID? How do you think it's going to structure around it?
Well, I think I'm hoping that, and I believe what's going to be better for us is simply more openness, a more open market, more level playing fields, that that U.S. companies can bid for projects in Turkey and be on a level playing field with Turkish companies in winning those projects, because frankly, it ensures you're going to get more innovation and better pricing. And the same thing here, that we should be looking and trying to seek the strongest outcome, not simply put the finger on the scale for the local company or someone who's tied to the government or has certain national interests. That doesn't say ignore it, but that doesn't say, because the alternative is if you only favor, and this happens a lot in China, local companies. You're all businessmen and business people on this call, on this webinar. If you know you have to compete, I don't know if how well this translates. You know, in the old days, you'd say, well, you have to sharpen your pencil, meaning you need to make sure you put in the best possible bid, not just on cost, but on quality, deliverability, reliability. And if everybody does that, we're better served. The public is better served, and companies in the long run are better served. So more openness and more transparency goes a long, long way, as opposed to sort of a back scratching favoritism that sometimes we see.
Well, let me. I want to ask you one, and perhaps this will be the final question as we come to the close of the hour. But I wanted to talk about, given your background, would you recommend the Turkish business community work more with the U.S. Exim Bank, and how so? Right? What role can the Exim Bank? And I know you could take another 4 to 5 hours on this question alone, because you're being probably one of the subject matter, probably best subject matter expertise in the world on this, but maybe you can sort of give them some north.
Well, I think that the U.S. Exim Bank, which suffered a lapse of several months and now has a board. It's got 3 members of the board. It's not a full board, but it's large enough to do transactions. I know they just approved a large LNG project in Mozambique, I think in the sort of $4 to $5 billion range. So the Exim Bank is certainly open for business. It's certainly available to finance, particularly it's strongest in capital projects and capital goods versus services. Turkish Airlines was a very large client of the Export-Import Bank in terms of the purchase of Boeing aircraft. And it remains so. We also did a number of large power plants and some petrochemical plants in Turkey that we also finance. An area that I think is sometimes overlooked, Joe, with Turkish companies, and that is if Turkish contractors are doing a project, say in the UAE or in sub-Saharan Africa, and part of the supplies for that larger project could be a rail project or a waterworks or power project. If some of that equipment or engineering comes from the U.S., the U.S. Export Bank will finance that. So the U.S. Export-Import Bank can be part of a financing package for large capital projects. We've done that with companies, a lot of the infrastructure firms that are located in South Korea and in Japan. And I would hope in the future they could do a lot more with contractors in Turkey, as I said, because that is a great expertise from my time and my recollection when I chaired the Export-Import Bank.
All right. Well, let me take this opportunity to sort of thank you again for participating with us. This has been fantastic, and sharing your expertise with it, learning the details of your book. But I, as someone who's going through it right now, it's a wonderful read. There it is, a plug for the book, like if we were on a TV show. But listen, it's a fantastic read, and it's really key for people to understand the benefits of trade. It's just a tough political subject, but in the end, it's a benefit to the world. I also want to thank Seymour Terry and Niall Olpak because they were key to putting this together. We've reached the end of our time, but as you can always reach out to any of us. And I want to thank again Morris for putting this all together. Morris Reed is always thinking a few steps ahead, so I appreciate this. And I also want to sort of put in my plug, not only for the book, but for you as our next Commerce Secretary. Hopefully, when Joe Biden wins, we're going to have someone that understands the key ingredient to world cooperation is the U.S. being a vibrant commercial actor, and not just someone who threatens our allies. So thank you again, everyone, for participating. Thanks again, Fred, and thanks to TAİK for putting this together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Hochberg. Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Since 1985, we have been pursuing business opportunities throughout the world by embracing this motto: more trade. Everything began with these two words. It was then that the Turkish private sector united to adopt a joint vision, and I was given my name. Well, who am I? I am a business platform that is empowered by my founding institutions, business councils, counterpart organizations, and members pursuing business opportunities all around the world, uniting all of my stakeholders. I am DEİK. DEİK has become the locomotive organization of our private sector. 2019, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Well, what do I do? Exports, imports, inward and outward investments, manufacturing, and so much more. I establish new bonds and relations through business forums, B2B meetings, roundtable meetings, conferences, panel discussions, and summits across the world. I have been vigorously striving to strengthen the dynamics of the economy, steering the world's wind of change, and enhancing interactions within the private sector. Hence, I generate major contributions to my members and to the private sector with the mission I carry. I reunite Turkish business people living all around the world under a common objective. With each passing day, people, countries, and even the continents come closer. The balances of international trade are rapidly changing, while the world economy is also being reshaped. I am not trying to keep pace with this change. I am steering this change because I consider trade not as an instrument of war, but as a tool of developing societies, glamorizing the world, and contributing to the advancement of technologies that preserve and protect nature. Therefore, I am Turkey's global horizon. I am carrying Turkey's strength to the world. Now it is time to act together. I want to make business with you through my 146 business councils. I am a business platform empowered by my members. Because our mission is business diplomacy. Since 1985, we have been pursuing business opportunities throughout the world